The Bookseller Crow on the box. Tales from an empty bookshop.
Well, I'm hoping that's recording. Good evening and welcome to the next in our series of talks from an empty bookshop. Here's me literally in an empty bookshop on my own. Tonight I'm going to be joined by Stuart Evers, who is joining us by the magic of Zoom and has written one of my favourite books of the year, if not my favourite book of the year so far, The Blind Light. I read it, I think, over the first weekend of lockdown, and it was quite prescient in a way, which I think we'll probably discuss a bit as we go along. Anyway, welcome, Stuart.
Hey, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm good. Lockdown been all right for you?
Yeah, it's been okay. It's been okay. Good to spend some time with my family, which has been good. But I normally work from home anyway, so some bits of it haven't really changed. But having the house full has been a challenge sometimes, I think. But yeah, it's been fun.
It's all been quite a challenge, hasn't it, really? I mean, I spent 3.5 months working on my own in the shop here by the window, watching a Sainsbury's queue while parcelling up books to dodge to the post office with for people, which has been good, and I've been very grateful for the business. It's been great. Anyway, The Blind Light, you're going to read a bit from it for us to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
so the Blind Light, sorry?
No, carry on.
So the Blind Light is takes place over 60 years of British history and British popular culture, starting in 1959 and ending in 2019. And essentially, it's a family story. It's a story of two families over the course of those 60 years, and particularly the central family, which is run by Drum and Gwen, who meet when they're in the very early 20s, when Drum is on national service and she is a barmaid trying to escape her life in Cumbria. The bit that I'm going to read to you is from the very, very early section in the book, and it's about Doomtown, and Doomtown becomes probably the central image of the book. And Doomtown is a real place. In fact, there were two Doomtowns. There was one in Cumbria and there was one further down south. And Doomtown was a place that British military or Air Force would send the national servicemen to learn about how to survive a nuclear war. And they did that by having a parade ground and creating a town and then blowing it up, basically. So it's a ruined town. They would learn how to deal with fallout and things like that. And so this little piece is just from the start of the book, and it's about the Drum and his friend Carter, who he meets on national service, about what they think and how they feel about Doomtown itself. They did not take Doomtown seriously, his fellow servicemen, or so it seemed to Drum. Perhaps they saw it for what it was: grown men playing war on a 2 square mile playground. They slept well, did not dream of the destruction, thought only of D-mob and their what, of heading home, of the lives that they would now lead. That's how it seemed as he envied their snores. In the mornings, there were field exercises in what they all called Doomtown. In the afternoon, short lectures in which they learned of blast radiuses, fallout drift, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Essential preparations, Jerick said as he put on a radiation suit and mask. The men invited in groups of 10 to try them out. Carter was in the first group. Drummond was called towards the end. He breathed heavily in the suit's interior silence, walked and felt the sensation of wading through deep water, heard his own heartbeat, terrifyingly fast. So the Doomtown, or the Doomtown, if you like, becomes the central image of the book between Carter and Drum, and it's a vision of terror and at the end of the world, basically. And that's how they come to find it.
I hope the sound outside of a car driving past with his bass going. Otherwise, that might be the drum and bass mix that you've just.
Absolutely, full of drum and bass.
So when you set out to write this, did you were you thinking in your head that it was going to be 500 pages long, or did it surprise you?
I knew it was going to be a long book, and I knew that I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be ambitious without being over-facing. And when I came to look at it, when I came to think about how it was going to be, I knew it was going to be an all-encompassing book. But then I had to make a kind of decision as to where to knock these things out. You know, like where. Can you pause it?
Right, recording.
So yes, so I knew it was going to be a long book, but what I really wanted to do was to try and work out how I could visit people over the course of 60 years, and at what points I would find them. You know, when would be interesting to catch up with them. And I found that like a really interesting technical challenge in and of itself, because the obvious thing is to maybe pick up with them on a particular day or a particular year, so like the first year of the decade or something like that, and perhaps like the Rabbit books, or maybe something like, you know, Our Friends in the North, one day in the 60s, 70s, whatever. And I started come to realize I didn't really want to do that. And my initial, when I started writing it, I wrote a sentence which would come to haunt me, which was no compromise. And one of those things was that I wanted to have certain sections, because each section follows the people who are alive at the time. So Drum and Gwen in the early ones, and then later ones Drum and Gwen and their two children, Nate and Anneka. And what I wanted to have was one of those sections to be really dull, because why would everything be exciting all at one time? And so when my editor read it, he said, this bit's really boring and pointless. And I was like, it's supposed to be. And he said, boring is never good. Boring is never good. So I went back, but it was very interesting to try and see where the obvious places. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was one that obsessed me. So I knew that had to be in there. And then I would kind of pick things out as I went along, and I would say, right, okay, 72 was a drum in 1970. There's a lot of strikes at the Ford plant where he works, and that was a really interesting point in time where, from talking to people in the research I was doing, is that the centre of London was kind of decaying. It was people were looking at other plans. You know, like what's your plan B? You know, where would you go if things start to really deteriorate? And so I kind of played on that, and so making decisions to where I would find the people was really interesting. And then just when I was doing the final draft, I terrified my editor by saying, I think I need to add an extra section. And he was like, oh, really? And I said, yeah, I think I need to have a 77 section. But the rule that I have for myself about doing a section 77 was that I couldn't mention the Heatwave, and I couldn't mention the Sex Pistols, but I could mention ABBA. That was my my strictures of myself.
I'm a bit older than you, and I probably lived through more of this than you did. I would imagine. But
yeah.
So, how much did you have to rely on kind of research to?
I did spend a lot of time researching. I'm not a very good researcher, I have to say, because I'm more interested. In fact, there's a quote from the invented poet in the book, Nicholas Oldman, where he is more interested in the impression of veracity rather than the absolute truth. And so I did do a lot of research, but I didn't make any notes. As Jim Crace said, you can do as much research as you like, just don't make any notes, because the stuff that sticks with you will stay, and that will be really useful and really interesting to work with. So I remember vividly the nuclear fear, and the book sort of came about because of that nuclear fear. So we went to visit the secret nuclear bunker at Hack Green in Cheshire, about 2012, it was 2013, and so my wife and my mum and dad, and we went down into the bunker, and on the door it says, experience all the terror of a nuclear war without the radiation. So it's kind of it's not a particularly classy kind of place. But we went down, and I was inside, so I was just terrified. It just brought all that kind of threads and that kind of mid-80s, particularly paranoia, like the sound of Two Tribes by Frankie Goes to Hollywood with the nuclear air raid siren at the start of the record. And it brought it all back. And I was wandering around inside. My mum, who's similarly kind of terrified of this kind of stuff, similarly quiet. And in front of us, just when we got out of the sick bay, which is even more terrifying, we saw this couple. They must have been in their 20s. And they were looking around. They weren't laughing and joking or anything like that, but you could tell there was ancient history to them. It was like a different world. It had no connection or correlation with their lives, and it just made me angry. It made me sad. It made me really angry. And we got out into the open, and I was just seething with that. I was like, how can it be that this crucial defining part of my life and of my mum's life and so many people that I knew is just nothing. It's like it never happened. And I thought, well, I've got to write about this, and I've got to think about it in that kind of way, and what the effect of that Cold War has had on us all. And while I was doing some research into the preparation, so Hack Green Secret Nuclear Bunker would have been a regional seat of government, of which there are about 16 in the UK, and they would be effectively the bureaucracy that would look after the survivors or impinge some kind of society on those people who survived, and they would be staffed by kind of dignitaries and VIPs and things like that. And so I started doing some research on that, and I ended up finding this Pathé newsreel about Doomtown. And as I was watching it, I saw it's like 2.5 minutes, and it's hilarious because it's got that kind of very BBC voice, and it's like, oh, good old boys are going to be all right against the Ruskies kind of thing. And then there was this image of two servicemen, and one of the servicemen standing over the other one, pouring him a cup of tea, one of them pretending to be been hurt in the nuclear fallout. And I thought that's my beginning point, these two men thrown together, because national service is not something we ever really think about. In fact, it's interesting, they just sort of recently floated a similar idea, and it was one of those things where occasionally you'd hear some old Buffed and Tufton say, "Oh, bring back national service." It's a really fascinating cultural experiment, and as in the book, Drum says, that this national service was brought in by a Labour government. It wasn't brought in by a Tory government; it was a Labour government. First time in history that there'd been peacetime conscription, but it meant that men from different backgrounds could meet. And in the course of the research that I did, I found that all the available books, and of which there are many books about national service, they do seem to suggest that upper class men would meet working class men, and they would mix very happily and get on very well, form very close friendships, and then literally, as soon as they demobbed, they wouldn't see each other. They would never see each other again. And it kind of reminded me, all the books I read seemed to have the same kind of truism, and it just reminded me of that bit in Blackadder 4 where Posh George says to Blackadder, "Oh, you must come and visit after this is all over, and we can relive the old times." And he says, "What you mean? But we could go and dig a trench in your garden and get the gameskeeper to shoot at us?" And I just thought it was a really interesting thing. So, but what would happen? What would happen if that friendship continued? What if seeing the end of the world would bind these two men together? and keep them kind of copacetic throughout history, throughout their history. And so I found that really interesting, particularly when I wanted to have their wives be very different to their actual husbands, and therefore that friendship being close but a very different kind of friendship to the male protagonist of the book.
And you use that kind of very successfully, but it seems to me that it recalls. It also recalls the novels of the time, of an earlier a time, the 1950s, 1960s.
Yeah.
Would I be right in thinking that that's a thread that or a theme that you were conscious of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things in the very, very early iteration of the book, what I wanted to do was to make every section be very stylistically influenced by the novels that I loved from that time. And I realized that was just untenable, basically. It wasn't something that I wanted to pursue, because actually the kind of, they are different in lots of ways, and all the different sections are different in very different ways. But I suppose the only one that still retains that flavour is the kind of 50s and 60s sections. And they are directly influenced by the kind of awakening that I had, because when I was growing up, you know, I didn't know anyone who would write. I mean, writers were like a different breed, like a different kind of. Well, you didn't aspire to be a writer. I mean, someone would laugh at you, say you want to be a writer. You know, if you wanted to be a journalist, that was like, people like us, we just don't. That's just not what happens. You know, that's. And so as a consequence, you know, a lot of the stuff that I was reading was at the time, say my teens, and I'd read like Orwell and Joyce, and I enjoyed those very much, and books that I get from the library. So I read John McGahn at that age, and Rachel Ingalls, and The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which you know, they all got these from the library sale. You know, it's just anything with an interesting cover. But they didn't feel like my books. They didn't feel like they belonged to me, and I didn't see myself in them. And in fact, I didn't even think that books could replicate the kind of life that I led, because it was just kind of dull. You know, it wasn't, you know, ridiculously poor. It wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination. My parents and everyone I knew were kind of solidly what I guess you'd call lower middle class or upper working class, or however you want to define that. You know, everyone was just kind of trying to protect what they had, kind of thing, you know, trying to make sure that, you know, that they wouldn't be made redundant, or they wouldn't lose the house, or whatever. And then a school librarian gave me a copy of Room at the Top, and it just blew my mind. It was just, you know, I mean, this was set in the 50s, but these were people that I recognised, people that I knew. They were utterly real to me. And when I read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which plays a huge part in the book, I knew all these people. These were people that I knew from down the pub or wherever it was. And you know, I hoovered them all up. L-shaped room, Ellery Banks, Lindy Banks, just fantastic. But Up the Junction, and you know, Poor Cow, and you know, they're all those books, and they had a really profound effect on me. And what I found frustrating was, like, later when I was bookselling in the mid to late 90s, those books didn't exist any longer. You know, that they were, if you wanted to read about those kinds of people, you had to read the Americans, because no British writer was going to write about those kind of things, you know. And I remember someone saying, well, what about Ian McEwan and The Cement Garden? And I said, yeah, sort of, except if it was one of the kitchen sink books, the boyfriend wouldn't have been a snooker player, he'd been a plasterer or something like that. But you know, there has to be the sense of the extraordinary about these characters, and rather than just being an extraordinary character in their own right, like like Arthur Seaton. So it is, it was hugely influential, and I always wanted to mix that kind of kitchen sink drama with twist of David Lynch or experimental European fiction, and just see what it looks like. And later in life, I discovered Berg by Anne Quinn, which was already doing that in the late 60s, but obviously filtered through a different kind of sensibility. I really wanted to evoke that sense of a working class life that was more than just sort of class tourism, if you like. It wasn't about people who are absolutely on the bottom of society, but just sort of like just one stage up from there.
Sure.
I find characters and I find people like that fascinating because they make up the vast majority of the country. But these people don't get any kind of.
Do you think maybe that in some ways those characters got transferred to kind of soap operas, Coronation Street and?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair comment. I think that's certainly those the early days of Coronation Street are pretty deeply influenced by the kind of kitchen sink dramas,
and also Z cars as well, and
yeah,
you used to have Play for Today, which was very often the plays of Peter Turson or someone like that, very much in that mould. And I think one of the great things about your book is that it is portraying those people who aren't portrayed in very many, if any, books at the moment. Including because there's lots about the class differences between the two main characters, but for want of a better term, the upper class person in the book is actually, by today's standards, not, he's not that rich, clearly. I mean, they've got money, but they're not that rich. They're not that influential. They're not, I mean, it's not Boris Johnson's family and, or, the majority of the.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to explore was that quite often, the people that you see with power and the people you see with privilege around you aren't the likes of Boris Johnson. I come from a small town in the northwest. Carter is the guy who goes to the golf club. He's the guy who drives the posh motor. But he's but yeah, you're right. By comparison to the proper landed gentry, he's a couple of stages behind that. I mean, he has got money, but it's all tied up in kind of history and family. So he is that kind of inherited wealth. And I thought that was important because what I wanted to explore, not only just the nature of a cross-class friendship, but also the difference in how you deal with fear and how your life is different when you have more control over fear and more control just in general. Because as a book, for me, this is a book primarily about control, how we take control of our lives, how we control other people's lives, and how much control we actually have in the grand scheme of things, from geopolitical events at the top level through to what your wife or your husband or your father or your mother is telling you at that particular point. So I wanted to explore that and where we come to try and find control, and what the knock-on effects can be, negative and positive, of us desperately trying to cling to some form of control. But that is different if you have virtually unlimited funds. In the case of Carter, he is in a certain amount of control because he has money. He has access to things that Drum simply doesn't. And what he's doing is occasionally holding out his hand and saying, do you want to be part of this? Do you want to have a semblance of control? But that relationship in and of itself is complicated by the fact of, like, who is actually in control of it? And what I wanted to do throughout the book is to give them moments where neither one of them was really certain who was actually in control of the relationship, who is actually part of that. Annoyingly, I discovered this via Kevin Barry. Kevin Barry said this in an interview, and it's the perfect quote, and I wish I got it first, but apparently, quote from Norman Mailer, and Norman Mailer says, whenever a man shakes another man's hand, whenever a man shakes another man's hand, one of them loses. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of very male gaze about how friendship worked. But it did kind of think that in this kind of push me pull you of existence between two friends, you know, that kind of fear that perhaps things aren't quite what they think they are. And there are moments in it where Drum feels that maybe he's been taken for a ride. Maybe his friendship is an illusion. He's just basically this kind of supplicant to this richer man. But then there are other moments where, you know, Drum feels like he almost pities Carter, despite his money and his obvious class and all the rest of it. He kind of pities him because there's something kind of missing at his heart, and Drum, even though he probably has a similar kind of parts of him missing as well, kind of does feel that there was an element of superiority there. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to generate, particularly when these men are in their late teens, and then you're still hanging around with them when they're in their 70s and 80s.
Are they still hanging around with you? If you've lived with them for 5 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I started work on it 7 years ago, and Drum and Carter came very, very quickly, and they all do. They all have a peculiar kind of pull where I can imagine the stilted conversation as Carter and Drum discuss lockdown, for example, and there's lots of kind of strange bits where. So as I was writing the book, Brexit happened, and all this stuff that I was talking about control suddenly became the hot ticket. It was, you know, and this often happens with novelists and you know, creative people. Is that what happens is that you're working on something and you think, oh, you know, you've sussed something, and then the whole world just reveals itself to you and said, oh no, we've been thinking this for ages. And it was, you know, about this nature of taking back control, having control of the future. And you know, at one point I thought, how do I avoid talking about Brexit? How can I not? If I'm going to, you know, I'm going to have these characters that they need to discuss it. And I talked to my very wise and very good friend Will Atkins, and he said, "Do you really need to do that?" And I was like, "I know, I don't think I do." And he said, just don't bother with it. There's just, you know, there'll be more than enough books and there'll be more than enough coverage of that. Just let it be in the background. You don't need it to be, you know, front and center. So it became another one of those decisions, like, can I leave it out? And in the end I did. So it was, which is good, because I don't know quite if anyone has the stomach to listen to a debate about Brexit between two fictional characters when it's annoying enough when you're talking to real people, you know. Yeah.
But do they continue to have a life now?
Yeah, I've just been writing a Christmas story actually, about drums, a Christmas of Drum, which I wanted to be for you.
Day one.
No, from back in the 50s. There's a minor character called Uncle Nudge, who's mentioned very briefly in the book.
Yeah.
And so it's really a story about him. But you know, it's interesting because Uncle Nudge is, I don't know if that happens to you, but every now and again my dad will just drop something into a conversation, and it'll be, you know, he's 72 years old, and it's like everyone turns around and go, I've never heard that story.
Yeah.
I've never even heard of this person. Who is this person? And he told us this story, but this was about 2 years ago, about his Uncle Nudge. And I said, why was he called Uncle Nudge? That's, I don't know. But Uncle Nudge died running from the bookies to catch the bus. And he sounds like he was a right character. So I thought, well, I'm going to nick him for I'm going to nick him for the book. So I'm writing a story about them. So they sort of hang around these characters, and particularly Gwen and Daphne, who are Carter and Drum's wives, but very much their own unit in places. And I miss them. I genuinely miss their company in a way that, you know, I don't, you know, I spent a long time with Drum and Carter, and I'll happily spend more time with them. But I genuinely miss Daphne and Gwen, because they kind of live a life that's quite kind of hemmed in and kind of trammeled, and yet they have these kind of amazing emotional adventures within these very, very small confines, and I find that fascinating.
Daphne wasn't down the pub with you last night, was she?
No. Daphne's a strictly a home drinker.
Okay.
Yeah, strictly a home drinker. She, you know, she'd go into parties, but she'd never be seen dead at a pub. But she might, in a restaurant maybe, but not in a pub. She wouldn't know what to do with herself. Although she'd probably really like it. She probably would. It's like, you can imagine someone stealing her away and taking her down the pub, and she'd be like, you know, that the rumour about Princess Di being taken by Freddie Mercury down to the Vauxhall Tavern, you know, like that kind of thing. She'd love the danger of it, to be around all these poor people drinking beer, and she'd go in and it's like, I don't know what to drink and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, they are. There's such a lot of emotional investment in them, and time, and, you know, I always think it's interesting, you know, when authors talk about their characters taking over in front of their eyes, and they do things, and Nabokov's turned around and said, well, you know, that wouldn't ever happen with my characters. My characters are my galley slaves. And I always thought it was kind of interesting, you know, kind of between those two kind of points. And what I found was with certain characters, like, for example, Nate, who's the son, was probably one of the most difficult characters to write, until I realised what he was like, and he kept kind of in the earlier drafts, he would kind of vacillate from one state to another in a slightly weak kind of way. But he's not a weak man, but he lives entirely in the moment. And when you look at what he does, is that he doesn't look back. He tries to avoid looking into the future. He's just putting one foot in front of another for the whole time. And that has its advantages, but it also has deep, deep disadvantages. And it's the way that he deals with that kind of fear of what is going to happen, you know. And he is also hidebound by the fact that his sister causes this great big kerfuffle in the family, this kind of cleave in the family. And so I kind of, he's probably the most difficult to get a handle on, until you realise that he doesn't think literally any much further than going to bed that night, you know. And, you know, that has these kind of huge ramifications for him, particularly in the moments where he has a long-running relationship with one woman, but then we're left to sort of extrapolate what happened in the 90s, and it's over in about 3 paragraphs, but all we know is it's not going to be not that good, really. And so I think finding those characters and then just giving them license to kind of evolve over time was really, really helpful for me. Because Drum came quite easy, as did Carter, but Nate and Anneka, they revealed themselves to me, more gradually, and that was kind of fun. It was kind of fun getting to know them over the course of the book, and then really feeling like towards the end that I knew who they were, and they both kind of terrified me in their own little way. But yeah, it was they're all hanging around. They're and all the other characters as well. There's because a lot of the book is that there's lots of invented books in the book. So there's extracts from memoirs, from collections of essays, a footballer's autobiography. Always wanted to write a footballer's memoir, always. There's extract from a travel book, and so what I really wanted to show was that those extracts sort of showed a slightly different side to the book, and those bits have really stuck with me as well. So I kind of sometimes wish that I'd actually written the whole books so that I could kind of read them myself.
Previously, you've published 2 books of short stories. Are you still? And you've just said that you're writing one at the minute, or
yeah.
Is that something you would continue with, another book of short stories, or now you've got bigger ambitions with?
The stories will always be there. I can't not be writing the story. There's always a story hanging around. This book was being written in the background while I was writing or finishing the last collection of stories. They're different mediums. They're different. They're just different approaches to the same problem of trying to get perfectly down on paper what is in your head. And I love the short form, and I love writing it. But the next book is a shorter novel. Thankfully, it's going to take me 7 years, hopefully. But it will be a shorter novel, principally inspired by paranoid 70s films at the moment. That's the plan. But the stories are always there. It's just I want to get these 2 novels out. Well, this novel and then the next one out of the way before I can really seriously think about another collection in that respect. It takes a lot of headspace to come up with a collection, because you want to make sure that they're good, and you want to make sure that they thematically link, and that they do feel like a satisfying experience. You can't just whack a bunch of stories together. I think some people do that. Like Laurie Moore can probably do that. Like I've written 10 stories. That's a book. There you go. But not for most other people, I don't think. So, yeah. So I just feel so deeply inside this book at the moment. The thought of actually going too far away from it is, even now, it's, having finished writing it, finished the last edits on it, 6 months ago, I still can't really get out of my torturous fug of being inside the book and wandering down the pub with Drum and Carter, or being up in the morning with Nate, changing doing the cows on the farm.
Last question. What did it feel like when you saw a pandemic approaching and you had a book coming out, and
Oh, well, yeah, that was quite something. So, you know, when things start happening around the book, and you kind of think, okay, are the omens good? And on the day that I finished, I think the third revision of the draft, they announced that there was going to be a new novel from Hilary Mantel. And I was like, well, yeah, okay, so that's Hilary Mantel. And then literally the day after was like, Emma McBride's got a new book coming out. And I was like, oh God. And then it was Anne Enright. I mean, these are all writers that I love. I mean, like, you know, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But I was like, oh, talk about competition. And it seemed like literally there wouldn't be a day going past without another big writer saying that they got a novel coming out. And, you know, Sarah Moss had got a novel coming out, and the new Martin Amis, you know, the kind of auto-fictional Martin Amis book was coming, and that was without all the other kind of like exciting debuts, you know, the Rainbow Milks of this world. And suddenly I just thought, oh God, this is really, it's going to be a really tough year to be published into, like a really tough year. And then the pandemic. I think the first time that I really knew that things were going to go really, really badly was when I realised that I didn't want to leave the house, and I was like, "Oh God, like that's bad news. I don't like that very much." And I didn't know what people would make of it. I didn't know whether people would want to read a book which is about fear and about paranoia during a time when people are have fear and are paranoid. And one of the interesting things about it was that while I was panicking about this, I had an email from someone who said it was a real comfort of a read, which I was like, that's not something I would have thought that someone would say, but quite a few people have said that it's weirdly comforting because it's about all of those moments where these awful things have happened, but actually, you know, we've recovered, we've got through it, we're out the other side. And you know, I think some people feel that way. I know other people didn't feel that way at all.
That was certainly my what I got from it as well was very much, like I said, I read it in I think probably the first weekend of lockdown, and very much thought got some comfort from it, you know. Yeah, I'm
glad about that because most of my writing is not that comforting, so it's kind of good to do that. I all I wanted to do really was to write a book that I didn't feel was being written, and I didn't feel that, you know, that if you're talking about British fiction, we have some tremendous and really ambitious writing going on, and you know, and I think ambitious rather than original, or singular perhaps rather than original, because I think originality is difficult to express, and you know, as soon as you say something's really original, someone will give you 5 reasons why it's not. But singularity, and I think we've got at this moment in time, we've got some truly singular writers knocking around in British culture from so many different backgrounds, and from debuts through to, you know, people, you know, on their 10th novel or whatever it might be. But I didn't see any books really doing what I wanted to do. And that's not to say that the gap in the market for it, or anything like that. It was just that it just felt to me that this was engaging with something that other writers just weren't engaging with, not because that they weren't capable of doing, or didn't, you know, just because they've got different concerns. And I really wanted to explore these kinds of themes, and I just really wanted it to be ambitious and to try and do something slightly different to what other people were doing. And you know, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, it's interesting that it comes around again. You know, that some of the things that I'm hearing about from people, like the level of fear and all that, it's almost packed into this book. You know, it's kind of through the DNA of the book. It's the same kind of thing. Incidentally, which I haven't put in the book, but I do think this is interesting, is that a whole bunch of people I saw on Twitter talking about masks, and that it's like a pip going through a chainmail fence, something like that. So, you know, the coronavirus is so small it will go through all of the perforations. And I was trying to work out where I'd heard it before, and it was exactly the same kind of people, men, talking about that, about wearing condoms during the AIDS crisis, saying, and it was almost word for word. It was almost exactly the same. I remember that, like, from 1990, well, not, it would have been 89, from 89 to now. And the choice of words was exactly the same. And I think that's interesting, that where conspiracies and people's conjectures meet, there's so many correlations going back through history. There's so many moments which are so similar, where the things that you're living through now, people have lived through before, and have perhaps acted completely the same as you, or have gotten really terrified and just like decided to decamp to the Malvern Hills or something like that. You know, that's the kind of thing. So I think there is a sense in this book of there's an endless repetition of this kind of fear from a high space of geopolitical influence, which is going to be terrifying. But then also, while that's all going on, you've got the same thing of just on the family level, where your fear can be allied to just one person within that family, and that's as terrifying as a nuclear war.
Thanks, Stuart.
You're welcome.
I want you to imagine the thunderous applause that's.
Thank you. I can hear it. I can hear the thunderous applause.
Maybe I'll do a Premier League add-on of crowd noises.
That's what you should do. That's a great idea. That's what like. And like, if someone's about to say something controversial, they go, "Ooh!"
Yeah.
Oh,
that's right. And then we have some tutting and.
Yes. Oh, yes. And maybe like the sounds of people tweeting in the background as well, just like, you know.
Yeah, and I'll cut just at the point where someone says, "Well, it's not really a question; it's more of